That's it. That's the plan. Yeah.
There he is.
Julian Assange's return home was a long time coming. Those close to him wondered if he would ever make it out of prison.
Can you describe the last 24 hours for us?
It's hard to describe. We've been waiting for this for so long.
Striking a deal between the US Department of Justice and the man they had been pursuing for years seemed at times impossible.
It was incredibly difficult, logistically, politically, and legally.
For the first time, two of the people closest to those negotiations reveal crucial details about how the deal was struck. The sticking points, the key players, and how it nearly all fell over.
None of us, when we started this case, thought it was going to end in a courthouse in the Pacific.
Journalists around the world today, Mr. Assange. Do you think justice was served today?
In 2019, Julian Assange was arrested for breach of bail after Ecuador withdrew his asylum. Soon after, he was indicted under the US Espionage Act for publishing classified military and diplomatic documents, as well as this infamous video showing journalists and civilians killed by US forces.
Light them all up. Come on, fire!
In 2019, the US, under the Trump administration, sought Assange's extradition from the UK. Barry Pollock says the US Department of Justice was in no mood to negotiate.
After it became public that he had been charged, their position was when he gets to the United States and has his initial appearance in the Eastern District of Virginia, we'll talk to you then.
After Joe Biden was elected president, Barry Pollock saw an opportunity to negotiate.
The Biden Department of Justice had issued new guidelines on prosecuting journalists, and so I wanted to make a presentation to them why I thought under their new policy the prosecution should not proceed.
The department listened, but didn't act. But in 2022, another election result helped change the game. Just over a month after he was elected, Anthony Albanese raised Assange's case with President Biden in Madrid. Around a year later, in London, the Prime Minister acknowledged that things were moving slowly.
I know it's frustrating. I share the frustration. I can't do more than make very clear what my position is, and the US administration is certainly very aware of what the Australian government's position is.
But behind the scenes, there was movement. Jen Robinson says the Prime Minister gave her some important information.
He and I had a conversation where he said to me that they had been having conversations with the US administration and he felt that there was a deal to be done, but it had to be done by us as his lawyers.
Anthony Albanese's new ambassador in Washington, Kevin Rudd, was about to become a key player in the push to release Assange.
I then flew to Washington to meet with Kevin Rudd, our ambassador, and my US co-counsel Barry Pollock, where we briefed Ambassador Rudd about the case and talked about what this was going to take.
Kevin was very vested in this, and he worked very doggedly with both the Department of Justice and myself, trying to nudge each party to get to a resolution that was acceptable to both of us. And I think a lot of times when you have a complex negotiation like that, having a third party almost serving as a mediator to try to bring the two sides together is enormously helpful, and Kevin played that role.
But despite their efforts, the negotiations ground to a halt.
We worked on a deal for months that involved a series of misdemeanors about mishandling classified information that would have allowed us and him to enter that plea remotely and come home to Australia. The DOJ then went quiet on that and we heard nothing for months on end.
But then a group of Australian politicians ramped up the pressure. A cross-party delegation of MPs visited Washington to meet with members of Congress and the Department of Justice.
I think they made a difference. I think the bipartisan support in Australia made a difference. And I think Prime Minister Albanese speaking out made a difference. I think it was all of those things.
And the legal case unfolding in the UK increased the pressure on the US. In February, Julian Assange sought leave to appeal to the High Court in London. It was seen as his last roll of the dice inside the UK legal system to avoid extradition. But it was the last roll of the dice for the US as well. And as internal emails published in the Washington Post show, their own lawyers were worried. One of their trial attorneys wrote, "The case will head to appeal and we will lose." They knew the US couldn't guarantee Assange free speech protections under the First Amendment, an assurance the UK judges were asking for.
I think they were under pressure on two fronts. First was there was a very real chance that we were going to win the extradition case on this First Amendment ground because, in our view, the US could not provide a satisfactory assurance about protection under the First Amendment. But the other point that people miss too is that the US was, I think, concerned about him being extradited and having a very public Espionage Act prosecution of a journalist in an election year.
At a time one of their journalists is in jail in Russia on espionage charges.
Precisely. You have a US journalist in prison in Russia, Evan Gershkovich, and the US is trying to negotiate their release. And what is the first thing the Russian government is going to say to them? Look at what you're doing to Julian Assange.
In the lead up to the hearings, Jen Robinson says she rang Australian Attorney General Mark Dreyfus and alerted him about the weaknesses in the US case.
After my conversations with our Attorney General Mark Dreyfus in January, he went and met the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, in the United States, and I think that was significant to make clear the Australian government's position and also to set out the points that we had raised, which is you may well lose this extradition case, and this is the moment to get the deal done.
In May, two High Court judges ruled that Julian Assange could appeal on First Amendment grounds, putting even more pressure on the US to come up with a deal.
We really had two lines in the sand, if you will. One was that if we were going to reach some negotiated resolution, that had to be the end of it. Julian was not going to do any additional prison time. The second was that Julian was very firm that he did not want to come to the United States for fear that if he did, he would be detained on some other charges.
The US was insisting on a felony plea, which meant Assange would have to appear in a US court. The solution? To hold proceedings in Saipan, a US Commonwealth in the Pacific.
That was a proposal by the Department of Justice. I think when it became apparent to them we were not going to move on those, they came up with a very creative proposal that met our needs, and that's what led to there being a resolution.
The negotiations over an agreed statement of facts took time, as the parties argued over particular points.
I think it's really important to highlight for people what's not in the plea deal and that statement of facts and why it's important. The first is no actual harm caused to any individual, and the US government could not identify one individual who was entitled to restitution as a result of these publications. The second point that's really important is after years of accusing him of hacking, of somehow doing something different to journalism, if you read that statement of facts, it is about receiving and publishing information from a source. That is absolutely journalistic activity.
Since the guilty plea, the Department of Justice released a statement saying Assange's decision to reveal the names of human sources illegally shared with him created a grave and imminent risk to human life. Around a week before his release, the parties finally came to an agreement on a plea deal.
Until the final detail was negotiated and both sides were ready to sign a piece of paper, you never knew.
How does it feel to be a free man, Mr. Assange?
It's still sinking in that we managed to pull it off and that he's home. It's been a very long time coming.